Hello, my name is Brian Lewis and I'm an instructor with JTNS, and today we're going to talk about emergency action fire prevention plans. Before we begin the presentation, I would like to give you the opportunity to pause the video and talk about any near misses, close calls, actual accidents that you've had, and have a good discussion and figure out how to keep that from happening in the future. After you get finished with that discussion, simply press play and then we will continue with the presentation. Okay, hopefully you had a great discussion, and if there were any issues, you got them ironed out and it's all good to go. So as we get forward, we're going to talk about emergency action plans, and we're going to talk about escape procedures. We're going to talk a little bit about fire prevention. So what's really important is when you look at the emergency action plans, or EAP, or fire prevention plans, FPP, we need to have escape procedures. What are we going to do in emergency? How are we going to shut down critical equipment? How are we going to account for people once we're out of the building or once we're in a place of safe refuge? What kind of rescue or medical duties do people have, or are we going to leave that to the firefighters? The preferred means of reporting emergencies, and this can be as fancy as you want it to be, or it can be really as easy as somebody saying fire or tornado and activating what we need to do. We also need to have the names of the people responsible for maintaining the plan and how often we're going to drill. Now, when we talk about how often we're going to drill, as people that know that I visit on a regular basis, it's important to do physical drills, but it's almost as important to do mental drills, to have a plan in your head and that you follow the plan as set forward, right? So keep that in mind. We can do mental repetitions as easily or more easily than we can do physical repetitions. The mental repetitions won't be as fruitful as the physical repetitions, but they do have benefits. They do have benefits. So why are we concerned? Well, you can be faced with an emergency at any time, and everyone needs to know how to get help and how to react. If we don't have a plan, we run the risk of falling into fight, flight, or freeze, and we don't want to do that. We want to be calm, and we want to go through the procedures that we've been trained on, and we want to do them effectively, and we want to be efficient, because the more effective, the more efficient we are, the more likely we are to save lives. So to keep that in mind, we're talking about preservation of life here and an emergency situation. So it's important that we act swiftly, we act calmly, and we go through the procedures as well as we can. So what's the most common types of emergencies? Well, you can have medical emergencies, people hurt, people get sick. We can have fire, smoke hazards, chemical hazards, and unfortunately nowadays we cannot leave out workplace violence. That's really important that we have those things under consideration. So what is your response during an emergency? Well, if we use the letters RCS, we can remember what we need to do as far as procedures go. R, recognize the emergency situation, and as the first step, I'm going to tell you early recognition is absolutely imperative. Early recognition saves lives. Does not matter if it is a fire, a tornado, a weather-related event besides a tornado, or workplace violence. So early recognition, being aware of your surroundings and what is going on, is absolutely important. Has to happen. C, call for help. We have to alert people what the emergency situation is. The earlier we recognize it, the quicker we call for help or communicate what's going on, the faster people can evacuate a building, find a place of safe refuge inside a building, or go into lockdown and preserve life that way. S, stay with victims until help arrives and in a medical emergency. So what I will tell you, and And this is sad that we're talking about it, but it's important. It's important. It's important that we realize that sometimes being a hero is knowing how to give first aid and knowing how to stop bleeding. A lot of the information shows that, especially in an active shooter situation, preservation of life by stopping bleeding is more important than any other kind of heroic thing we could do, right? So a lot of times when we play these scenarios in our minds, we think of what we would do in this and if this happened and all that sort of thing. And I understand that. I understand that. But being a hero is taking care of people that are injured, taking care of people that are hurt. And so first of all, we want to use our PPE and any kind of work practices that we need to do, but we want to make sure that we can help victims, right? Make sure we help victims till someone with more knowledge and skills arrive. So having said that, it's really, really important that you only give first aid based on the training that you have. Don't try to go beyond your training. That's not what you want to do. If you're given CPR, it's always great to have multiple people there, because 5 minutes of doing quality CPR is really tiring, and we want to make sure we give everyone as good a chance to survive as we can, right? So some key questions. What's the quickest way out of the building? What do I do in a fire? What do I do in an active shooter situation? What type of alarms do we have at work? Now, different work areas are going to have different kinds of alarms. You may have a fancy alarm with a strobe light and a piercing sound that lets you know, hey, the building's on fire, we need to go to a muster point so we can count people. You may be in a area like a big warehouse where you have to use an air horn or some kind of intercom. They'd simply say fire or tornado or whatever it may be. You may have multiple beeps of an air horn that might tell you something else. Or, since a lot of people work out in the field, you're riding in a vehicle or truck with somebody, it's not unheard of for an electrical fire to start under the hood of a truck or a car. It's okay to look at the person you work with and say, it's on fire, it's time for us to pull over the road and get out. So that's important. Make sure you understand that when you go to the gathering point or the muster point, it's important that you don't leave that spot until we talk and whoever's in charge counts heads, and they can speak to the firefighters that have arrived on site and let them know everyone that was in that building has made it out. That way they can concentrate on containing the fire and not doing sweeps for people that could possibly be inside the building. We can reduce the risk to firefighters' lives by doing that. Also, where the nearest firefighters, if there's a beginning or incipient stage fire, it will allow you to address that also. So when does it begin? Emergency action plans are required by 1910.1038. It needs to be in writing. It also have to have some training and make sure employees know how to respond safely to emergencies that are reasonably anticipated. So fire is pretty much reasonably anticipated in a lot of, if not most, scenarios. In Tennessee, especially middle and west Tennessee, tornadoes are something that can be reasonably anticipated. Active shooter situations, obviously, and there may be others. Now in Tennessee, probably do not have to worry too much about hurricanes. That may be something for the Gulf Coast and the East Coast. So we want to only train on things that are reasonably anticipated. It's important that we give all the information that's needed, but not any more, right? All the information that is needed, but not any more. So evacuation and relocations in case of severe weather or fire. So if you have severe weather, you want to find and designate a place of safe refuge. that doesn't have any kind of glass, mirrors. You want to avoid kitchens that have small metal objects like knives and forks that can fly around. You want to go as the most structurally sound place in the building. Fire, explosion type things, bomb threats, hazardous material releases. We want to address that. Fire, explosion, we want to get out of the building. Bomb threats, you want to follow the process or the procedures that are in place. Hazardous material releases. Now, depending on what the hazardous material is, depending on where it's located, you may close all the windows, turn off the heating, ventilation, air conditioning units, and just hang in place and let that material disperse throughout the atmosphere so that it becomes less toxic. Other times you may want to know which direction the wind is blowing and evacuate and go in the opposite direction the chemical is being taken by the wind. So there's multiple ways to address a lot of these potential releases, hazardous material releases, and you need to think about what the potential is and how you're going to approach each specific kind of chemical release. Like I said, there's always the potential for severe weather. There's always the potential, unfortunately, for active shooter situations. We need to take all that into consideration. Procedures. Well, we need to make sure we understand. Do we have a watch? Do we have a warning? Do we need to be aware? Who's going to monitor the situation? Are we going to have a NOAA weather radio available that gives us this information automatically? Who has the authority to put that emergency action plan into action? Do we have a manager, somebody at the site, someone that's responsible for counting people at the muster point? Who is responsible for having communication with the outside? Sometimes in some of these situations, outside communication is going to be difficult. May have to use radios or other means of communication because there's not always there is always the potential that cell towers will be down. That's important. Critical equipment that may need to be shut down. Excuse me. You got to have a procedure for that. You need to conduct surveys. Make sure that any kind of potential utilities that can create additional hazards are shut off. An example of that might be natural gas and creating a fire type situation in the event of, say, an earthquake or a tornado. So we want to address those situations and make sure we have those covered. Evacuation signals need to be tested, make sure they work. We need to make sure emergency lighting works. Need to make sure the illuminated exit signs for emergency exits work, and in case of power failure, all that works. You ought to have active physical drills at least annually. I encourage people to do it a couple of times a year like we used to do in school. Staging areas ought to be clearly identified, maps, routes posted throughout the facilities. This is all important, especially for visitors. If you're a worker there, you're employed there, you probably understand or hopefully have been trained on where you need to go and what you need to do. Having said that, visitors don't always know the procedures. They need somebody with them to inform them what's required, what they need to do, and they need to be able to look on a wall and see, hey, this is where I need to go. This is my primary evacuation route. This is my secondary evacuation route. Need to be able to count heads. Like I said before, we want to make sure that our firefighters aren't put in harm's way unduly, right? If everybody that was there in the building made it out, the firefighters can concentrate on controlling and not allowing the fire to spread instead of doing a head count and having to go in and look for people. Emergency team sweeps. This is what they will do if not everybody has made it out of the building. And unless you're a firefighter, unless you have specific training, you do not need to be doing emergency team sweeps. Leave that to professionals that know what to do, how to do it, and how to survive while doing it. You stay where you need to stay at the muster point until an all clear is given by someone that's in charge. So that's important also. That's not the time for us to go get in the truck, go to a remote location, and continue working at a different spot. It is time to stay put until we have a clear understanding and control over the site has been achieved and the emergency has been abated. It's important that we do those things. Alarm systems. Alarms are used for communication, right? And we've talked about that a little bit already. You may have a fancy alarm system. You may not have a fancy alarm system. What's important is that whether it comes over the intercom, that you understand what you are being signaled to do. So it's important. Of fire, you do one thing. If it's active shooter situation, you do another. If it's a tornado or other some kind of natural disaster event, you know what to do there. And the alarms are all going to be different. They're going to be different, and it's important that we communicate properly, and communication's always a two-way street. You have the person giving the information, you have the medium through which the information's being given, and you have the receiver. And it's important that all those sections of communication are given respect so that we all know what to do in the event of an emergency. Training requirements. We train when we're employed initially, when emergency action plans changed or revised, when employee responsibilities change, when we hold drills. We learn what we need to do. We develop muscle memory. We have a mental idea of what's important to be done and what order it's to be done with. OSHA requires that we hold these drills as often as necessary to keep employees prepared. So this is a performance type standard. You may be able to do it one time and know exactly what to do and how to do it. You may have to do it multiple times a year. It's important that we know what to do and that we develop muscle memory and a mental outlook on how to do these things correctly, right? So, talking about fire prevention plans, we have a list of major fire hazards. Where are the flammable materials at? Where are the combustible materials at? How do we dispose of waste that is combustible or flammable? How are we going to maintain safeguards so that we don't get these things ignited? So, along with the list of major fire hazards, we also want to list what are the potential sources of ignition. How do we keep these things separate? How do we control them? This is all important, as well as the name and title of employees responsible for the equipment, responsible for controlling the fuel, responsible for controlling ignition sources. That's all really important. So some of the plan elements, we want to make sure, as I said before in the previous slide, we want to make sure we know what the hazardous hazards are. We want to determine the fire hazards, where our flammable storage is, how much of the flammable materials we have. Do we need to store this outside of the main building? Flammable storage cabinet. How do we handle this? Do we need to bond and ground? What types of flammable materials? I've used the term combustion, but really OSHA does not really have combustible materials anymore. It's all degrees of flammability. Where is it located? What are the potential ignition sources? How are we going to control that? Hot work operations. If you're doing welding or you're lighting a torch, do we make sure that what we're doing is appropriate and we're not going to cause a hazardous situation where we create a fire or explosion? How are we going to restrict open flames? Some places have natural gas or propane tanks outside. We certainly want to control that outside as well as lightning and any other kind of electrical discharge, static or otherwise, and make sure we control these situations and control these events as much as we can, so that this ignition sources as in the fire hazards or the flammable or explosive hazards don't meet together and cause a hazardous situation. We want to avoid that, right? Housekeeping. We want to make sure that flammable combustible materials are kept at a minimum and that they are kept in metal closed containers. We want to keep anything like oily rags in a metal container with a metal lid. We want to remove that at the end of the shift or the end of the day from the building. We want to make sure trash and housekeeping is such that that stuff is picked up from the floor. You've got ample room to evacuate. We do not want blocked fire exits or anything like that. We want to remove spray residue if you're spraying flammable material. And we want to make sure that we only have enough there for that shift, that day's work. That's really important. The only thing worse than trying to escape a maze is trying to escape a maze that is on fire. So we need to know our primary routes of evacuation and our secondary routes of evacuation in case the primary route is blocked by fire. And that's why we want to keep all our housekeeping in order. Make sure we don't have things that can burn or explode in our way to the exit. We want to know fire extinguishers, where they're located. If you are trained on fire extinguishers, what's the proper use of fire extinguishers, which is basically beginning stage or incipient stage firefighting. Once material like the walls or furniture become involved, it's no longer beginning stage or incipient stage. Professional firefighters need to be employed to put that out or called. How do you operate the fire alarm system? How do you get rid of smoking materials? Electrical safety, which can always be a part of the ignition source. We'll make sure how we keep ourselves safe as far as having the right kind of electrical equipment in the right kind of areas. We want to know how to store flammable and combustible materials, not to store them with oxidizers and other things, and make sure our compressed gases are handled correctly and that they are secured correctly. It's important that they're handled correctly and secure correctly. So just a brief summary. Know your evacuation and relocation routes and staging areas. Know when it's appropriate to go outside. Know when it's appropriate to find a place of safe refuge internally. Know what the alarm system, know what the person who activates the alarm system is trying to tell you. Is it a fire? Is it an active shooter? Is it a tornado? Some other type of natural disaster type situation? We want to make sure we understand what's being communicated to us. Firefighting is limited to incipient or beginning stage fires. If you've been trained on how to use a fire extinguisher, that's really important. So, most places use ABC fire extinguishers. A is for things that make ash like wood, paper, cardboard. B is for boiling type liquids, flammable liquids. C is for electrical circuits. ABC fire extinguishers. They also have numerical ratings that tell us how large a fire someone that is an experienced with a fire extinguisher can put out. How are we going to control incidental spills? How are we going to control incidental spills? That's important, and it's dependent on the type of chemical that's being spilled or released. Right? Those things are important. All employees need to be familiar with the site emergency response plan and be able to communicate, be able to activate the plan, understand what's being said to them when the plan's activated. Its plan is intended to create effective communication. Effective communication requires that the communicator be effective and that the person listening effectively understand what's being communicated to them and what the procedures to shut down, the procedures to evacuate, the procedures to shelter in a safe place, what all that means. Remember to use RCS to recognize the emergencies, call for help, and stay with victims, not go beyond your training. Once again, I'm very thankful that you all paid attention during this presentation. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact your JTNS instructor. As always, we may not know the answer right off the top of our head, but we will research your question and give you an answer the best that we can. You all be safe, have a great day, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Bye.